and together with Imi Mazkara of FZY, we're hosting this event on behalf of the Zionist Youth Council in partnership with March of the Living. The ZYC represents Zionist youth movements from right across the Jewish community: B'nai Akiva, BBYO, RSY, LJY, Noam, FZY, and Haborim Dror. The ZYC gives us the opportunity to come together as Jewish youth and to speak with one voice for the youth of our community. Our last event was at Hanukkah, when we stood together against Uyghur genocide and heard testimony of the persecution of Uyghur Muslims. Tonight, we are honoured and humbled to be joined by Holocaust survivor Marla Tribich, who will tell us her testimony and answer your questions. Taken together, these two events show the power of Jewish youth and the importance of Holocaust Memorial Day as a time to look back into our past and hear witness testimony of the Holocaust, but also as a time to look forwards, to renew our commitments to keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive and using it to inspire us in the fight against genocide. Before we begin, please note this event is being recorded. Please also stay muted unless called upon for questions at a later point. At any point during the event, you can submit your questions that you would like Marla to answer on the chat function to the host, which is marked as March of the Living. I do apologise in advance if we're not able to put all of your questions to Marla, but I'm sure there'll be some time later on that you can discuss them as well. I'm honoured to introduce Marla Tribich to you this evening. Marla was born Marla Helfgott in Piotrków, Poland in 1931. Piotrków was a town of around 55,000, just over a quarter of whom were Jewish. Marla was the middle child of three, with an older brother Ben and a younger sister Lucia, and she has described her time before the war as a normal, happy life in a loving family. In 1939, her life changed, and over the next 6 years she spent time in a ghetto, time hiding in a different family, and time in concentration camps such as Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen. She was liberated from Bergen-Belsen in 1945 and sent to Sweden before being reunited with her brother Ben in England in 1947. After that, she met Morris Tribich, a soldier who had served in North Africa and Italy. They were married in 1950 and went on to have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. She later gained the education she was denied during the war, going on to gain a degree in sociology from London University. About 20 years ago, she started to speak about her experiences during the war and has since spoken to many thousands of people. For her incredible efforts, she was presented an MBE by the Queen in 2012. Imi is now going to ask Marla some questions about her experiences before we move on to your questions.
So I've had the pleasure of being on March the Living and hearing Marla speak in Poland and meeting her personally, and also various times in London. So I'm really honoured and excited to be here speaking with you tonight, Marla. So Harrison briefly mentioned what your life was like before the war. When war broke out, you were put in the ghetto in 1939 in November. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And I know your father set a special mission for you. So can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Well, life in the ghetto, incidentally, my town was the first one to have a ghetto when war broke out. So by the 1st of November, we had already been forced out of our home into the ghetto walls. And that was very early because some ghettos didn't start till 41 and in the middle of 41. But after that, they all had ghettos, or there were no Jews in the towns or villages where they were, and therefore they didn't have ghettos. And life in the ghetto was very precarious, very stressful, very sad, and we were deprived of the most basic human rights. We were short of food, there was great overcrowding, and our Jewish population was 15,000, but at its height, the ghetto had 28,000 people, because I lived on the German side of the border. German side, where the German border was, near the German border. So that part was immediately annexed and became part of Germany. And the Jews had to move out of there, or some went of their own accord. And we ended up with 28,000 in our ghetto, which became very, very overcrowded.
And you were there for quite a long time before you moved. So Did it ever start to feel like normal life at all? Did you ever get used to what it was like there?
I never really thought about that. It did. We did get used to it because 2.5 years is a long time. But one never really gets used to those conditions. And as they continue to get worse and worse over time, because more people came in and more people were being sort of arrested and killed and pursued, and there were the labor camps outside and people had to work, and there were all, for instance, there was the man in charge of the ghetto, the German, whose name was William. We called him Willie. He used to turn up with a big black dog. I don't know what kind of dog. I don't know the name, the breed, but he was very ferocious and he was trained to attack Jews in a certain way that I won't even repeat. And things got worse and worse as time went on because we were being deprived of all our possessions. Whatever we managed to keep, they wanted. And for instance, they used to, notices used to go up on the walls saying to report to certain place at a certain time and bring all you jewelry and money. But it ended up with, our coats, particularly fur coats, because the winters were very cold in Poland. So we constantly had to give things up. Even when we didn't have them, they were demanding them. Like eventually we ran out of money because they, perhaps some people kept some secretly because it was very important. Because there was a black market, then you could get things on the black market. But if you didn't have money, then you had nothing.
And so after that period, your family decided to send you and your cousin away. Can you share that story and a little bit about what happened there and then?
Yeah, well, after about 2.5 years, rumors starting circulating that the ghetto was going to be liquidated, everybody was going to be deported. And we know what that deportation meant. They were going to go to annihilation camps, not labor camps. They were going to be like places like Tribich, Majdanek, Sobibor, and no one came out of there alive. People were in panic and tried to save themselves. Well, some of them had friends outside who would perhaps protect them for a little while. Some people left the ghetto. They smuggled themselves out and lived in the sewers and the forests. But my parents, together with my aunt and uncle, the Kleins, Joseph and Dora Klein, were offered a place for 2 children, 2 girls, by a man who was willing to hide 2 girls, but at a price. And that was in another town called Częstochowa, which wasn't all that far away. It was a sort of an hour's or little more ride from by train. And he was doing it for money. And this man was not only Christian, he actually was of German origin. And because of that background, then all these people were called Volksdeutsche, being right on that town being right on the border. So there were a lot of Germans living there and a lot of Poles living probably in the town across the way. And because he was what we call a Volksdeutsche, he enjoyed more privileges than the average Pole, and we were going to be even safer with him for that reason. And they came over to Poland. He came with his sister-in-law. Arrangements were made. He was paid in advance. And he said he would come back the following week and collect me, and the week after my cousin. Now, my cousin Ija was an only child, and my aunt and uncle were very concerned that she should go first, but he insisted on taking me first. Anyway, it all happened. We found ourselves in Częstochowa, on the outskirts, in a house with middle-aged people. The man who came for us was in fact their son-in-law. He lived around the corner with his wife and child. And we were they weren't exactly thrilled to have us, but they tolerated us. They didn't ill-treat us, and we were supposed to be relatives who had come to stay from Warsaw. They chose Warsaw because you're not as easily recognized from a large town as from a small town. So we were very vulnerable, very scared, very homesick. And whenever there was a knock on the door, sometimes it was okay for us to stay and socialize. But the other times they quickly bundled us into a cupboard under the bed, anywhere out of sight. We never know where we were. But my cousin, who was, as I told you, an only child, she was so unhappy and so scared and so homesick. She couldn't bear it, and she asked to be taken back home. She was told that she can't go because the deportations are still happening. But she said that her parents had very good friends in Piotrków who were looking after their valuables, and they would take her in. And the men said, okay, off they went, and I was languishing there for what seemed like a lifetime. But eventually it was my time to go home. And of course, you realize I'm leaving out all the details because there's so much more to it that I'm telling you. Now, arrangements were made that he would, we would meet my father in a flour mill, which before the war belonged to him and partners. Now it was, he was lucky to have a job there. So when we arrived, there was my father waiting, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein. And my uncle looked at us and he went white with shock. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the men said, "We have taken her back to Piotrków, to your very good friends." He did say the name. I'm not mentioning any names. And he said, "But she isn't there. Where is she?" And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking down on the ground, pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" This is such a vivid memory I have of that, because I was absolutely shocked. I didn't know what was happening. I mean, I was so sure that she was home and safe. And well, it's really the end of the story, because Ija was never seen again. She just disappeared without trace. And well, I could go on a lot about it. My uncle was arrested and with a lot of other people and imprisoned. And they released some, and the rest they took to the Jewish cemetery, lined them up against the wall, and they were all shot. So my aunt lost her husband and her daughter, all in a very short space of time. She survived the war. And when her first priority was to go back and find this man and go back to Piotrków, see who's left. But these German people, half German, they had left. There was no trace of them. And the good friends told my aunt that the men came with Ija. They collected a case full of valuables, and he left with Ija in the case. And my aunt said to me, how could anybody kill a child? I don't know what word she used because I can't bear to use that word. But anyway, they did away with her. We don't know how. And she said, I would have given him everything I possessed if only he had saved her. And she lived with this terrible pain. She occasionally spoke about Ija, and I wish I had asked more questions. Maybe she knew just something, anything, or some. All I know is that Ija was terrified of any sort of men in uniform. If she saw a German soldier, she would run and hide. And my aunt said to me on one occasion, she said of different things over the years, but I think one of the most tragic things she said was, my Ija had to walk into the gas chamber by herself. There was nobody to hold her hand. And this is a pain she lived with for the rest of her life. But strangely enough, she's always been very loving and warm towards me. And so looking back on it, I really can't understand that after all, she lost her child, I survived, but she didn't hold it against me because obviously it wasn't anything to do with it. I didn't have anything to do with it, but as time goes on, I think about it more and more. One of the great sadnesses of that period.
Thank you so much, Marla. I mean, I've heard that a couple of times, and it's still just as harrowing as the first time I've heard that every time you tell it. So that takes us back to 1943, when the ghetto was going to be liquidated and you were going to be deported. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened then?
Well, then, you see, when I came back to the ghetto, and I mean, there's so much detail to really see the picture, but we don't have the time. So when I came back, I found my family intact because my brother had a work permit and my father, mother, and sister were all in hiding during the deportations, but they were not far from home, and they were, each one was a different family. It was too risky to have more than one or two people. And so they all survived, but that was very unusual. There were now out of the 28,000 people, there were now 2,400 left. The 28,000 was made up with all the extra people that came into our ghetto because our original population, Jewish population in our town was 15,000. But after the 28,000, there were 2,400 left, and all these people had work permits, they had jobs. We were a whole family, because we weren't legal, because they knew that a lot of people had sort of smuggled themselves back into the ghetto, but they turned a blind eye because they had their plans. And after they thought everybody was back, that was in hiding and intended to come back and was there, then they started rounding people up. And one day but the legal ones were always in hiding somewhere. But one day they stormed into a room where my mother and sister were. I was there as well, but they left me behind. They took everybody, there were a lot of people. and they took them to the synagogue, which was now dilapidated, and it had been used for horses. They held them there without any food or water, and they were adding more and more people as they were searching for them and taking them to the synagogue. The synagogue was surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers guarding it, and they used to shoot through the windows and kill and injure people, and they were only doing it to amuse themselves because they really were bored. And they were held there for I don't know how long, but there's something I really mean to find out because it's all documented, but it was something like 2 or 3 weeks. And then on the 20th of December, 1942, they marched them out at dawn in groups of 50. And the first group to a forest called Rakov. And the first group found their communal grave waiting for them. And the others followed, and they had to dig graves. And it was all horrific. They were killed in the most horrific way. And we know exactly what happened because there were the witnesses who came to tell us. I remember my aunt telling me about it. And they said the earth was moving after all these people in those big communal graves. So they shot them randomly, and some of them probably weren't even dead. And that was the sort of real tragedy. We learned it very soon after it happened. The news reached us. So that's how I lost my mother and sister.
And when you were deported, you found yourself in Ravensbrück.
Yeah, but that was much later.
Yeah, in 1944.
Yeah. Or shall I just skim through to that very quickly?
Yeah, okay. Sure.
I won't go into detail, but because there's another cousin's story. After the deportations, they were still rounding people up, even sometimes people with jobs. And on one occasion, they rounded up my aunt on my father's side, so their name was Helfgott. And my aunt was taken away screaming, "Who will look after my child?" And by then, I was the only female member of the Helfgott family, and was down to me. So I was 12 by then, and my cousin was 5, and I looked after her. And then we were transferred, but something really important happened between that and the transfer to the labor camp. Because while the people that had been left after the deportation, they all had jobs, they were legal. And they had jobs in these particular 2 very large concerns where they were now going to live. They were building barracks for them. But there was still a lot of illegals, like my cousin and me and a lot of other people, mostly women and children and some elderly men. So they searched the ghetto, got them all outside, and we were waiting. We were in a column outside the ghetto walls, outside the ghetto gates, and we were being deported. So, and deportation itself could take half an hour to describe what it's like. I've become conscious of it when, on one occasion, a schoolgirl came up to me after my talk, and she said, "Excuse me, but what actually happens at a deportation?" And that made me realize that the terminology for the Holocaust is different. You've got to understand what people are talking about. Because if anybody is deported, people are being deported even now from England, from other towns, because I don't know, they've committed whatever. So if they're deported, what happens? They're taken by car to the airport and given a meal on the way, and they're put on a plane and they're deported. But the deportations were the most frightening things. I have only experienced the small one. But the big ones were really horrific because people were terrified and children were crying and dogs were barking and they were shooting people. It wasn't a quiet sort of well-organized event. So that's so much for deportations. But we were being deported, and I'll just tell you very quickly that we were guarded. There were a lot of soldiers with their rifles, Jewish police, and I looked sideways. I was towards the end and looked sideways, and I saw a German officer. And I don't know what gave me the idea. It was on the spur of the moment. I just walked up to him and said that I've been separated from my father, and rather, could I go back to them? They're in the ghetto. So he was very surprised and amused, but he had a kind face. I still remember him. And he called over a Jewish policeman and said, take her back inside the ghetto. On the way, he said, the policeman, I said, excuse me, I've got to get my cousin. And he said, you can't because she hasn't had permission. Now, I want you to think about that, because the Holocaust was full of these dilemmas. And I was at the age of 12, I was stuck with this dilemma of what do I do? Do I go to my parents, abandon my cousin? It was quite awful, but I wouldn't give in. I kept on arguing. I just wouldn't take no for an answer. And maybe it was because he was a Jewish policeman, but in the end, he said, go on then, quickly, get in and go in. So that was a real bit of luck, because I know where those children turned up. And on my PowerPoint, which I haven't got here, I've actually got the memorial for them in the forest, because they apparently approached the mothers and said, look, give us your children, because you are going to labor camps. You won't be able to look after them. We will build a children's home and they'll be all right. And that's where they ended up, in the Rakov forest. So after that, we were allotted to a very big concern where they made plywood from scratch, and then huts for the soldiers, and they sent to the front. We were there for about 18 months. I started working. I was a slave laborer at the age of 12 and didn't work. And after about 18 months or so, they marched us to the railway station and we were deported. The men were sent to Buchenwald. I know that now, I didn't then. And I, with the women, ended up in Ravensbrück. So we're now at Ravensbrück.
Yeah, so can you tell us about what it was like when you arrived there and some of your experiences there?
Yes, well, I'll tell you the arrival. The first thing they did was to take everything away from us. We didn't bring much, but whatever it was they took. Then we had to queue up and give our details, because they were meticulous at record keeping. Then we had to undress. They took our clothing away. They shaved our heads, and we went through cold communal showers. When we got out at the other end, we were given the concentration camp garb, this striped jacket and skirt. And when we looked at one another, we could not recognize each other. It's very difficult to describe what it does to you, to be stripped of your identity. And I won't go into details when I'm speaking at school. I always make them really aware of it. I always say that, you know, we are all different. We all look different. We're different personalities. It's what we wear and how we do our hair. But there was none of that. All that was gone. We just felt, we didn't feel human anymore. And we started losing hope. And without hope, there's no survival. And I would like to say a bit more about hope, that unfortunately there isn't the time. So it showed itself very quickly in that my aunt died after a very short time of arrival. And my aunt Franja Klein, my friend Pema Blachman died soon after that. And I always, when I talk about the victims, and I know them, I knew them, I always mention the names. And I think that's so important because there were people with names, with families, with a life. And when you start talking just victims, they lose their individuality. So we weren't there very long, about 2.5 months. I won't go into details about Ravensbrück. And then they deported us again. And this time, after a shorter journey, we ended up in Bergen-Belsen. Now, when we arrived there, they were so overcrowded. It was towards the end of the war, but we didn't know that it was coming to. I certainly didn't know it was coming to an end. Some people tell me that they could hear bombing, and maybe there probably was some information filtering through, but I didn't know. So then, which word did I stop? Well, when we were deported this time again to Bergen-Belsen, and when we arrived there, they didn't have any room for us. They put us in a tent overnight, and in the morning they let us into the camp. And do you want me to describe what I saw?
Absolutely, if you wouldn't mind.
The first thing that struck you as you walked in was the smell and the smog. And there were people there, but there were skeletons. And they were shuffling along like zombies. And they would just shuffle, and some of them would just drop dead, literally. They just collapse and die. And there were dead bodies everywhere, and piles of bodies, and piles of naked, twisted, decaying corpses. It was absolutely horrific. And on our way to the barracks, I heard from someone that there's a children's home somewhere in the camp. I quickly set off with them to find it. We were interviewed by 2 women, Dr. Bimka and Sister Luba, and if you read about Bergen-Belsen, you'll come across their names. And after asking us a lot of questions, they turned to me and said, we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you are too old. By then I was 14. And I said, okay, I understand. Will you take my cousin? And they said, yes, absolutely. But there was no way Anne would stay without me. She was really adamant, and in the end, they relented and let us both stay. And that was the greatest piece of luck, because we would not have survived in the general camp. So it wasn't that much better there. This was set up by some women. It's got a very special story of its own. They were mostly Dutch children with a really exceptional story, but there's no time to tell it. And it wasn't much better than outside, but for the first time in a few years, we're now being looked after. We're not just on our own, two little girls, really, all these about 3 years that we were, well, yes, from 42, the end of 42, 43 to 45. And I was looking after but even here, with the slightly better conditions, I succumbed to typhus. I was lying on my upper bunk by the window, and I could see people running. I didn't know why they were running, but I couldn't move a muscle because I had gone down as typhus, and this is such a debilitating, terrible illness. And we had to bear it without any medicine or anything. We either lived or died, but mostly died. But I somehow survived typhus. So, well, I saw these people running, and that was the 15th of May when we were liberated by the British Army. And just as a postscript, but very important one, is that they were wonderful. And really, it needs more time to describe how wonderful they were. And for the first time in 5.5 years, we're suddenly being treated like people again, like human beings. And they were very kind, and they were really very special. There are a few things I could tell you that were exceptional, but I'll stop here and you go ahead and ask me more questions.
Well, I think, firstly, thank you so much. After the war, so after you said you were liberated from Bergen-Belsen and you recovered, you were sent to Sweden, partially to recuperate and to heal. And then in 1947, you received a letter from England about that your brother Ben had survived. So can you tell us a little bit about that and about the reunion?
Yes, well, I didn't actually learn it in 47. I learned it much earlier, but it was quite a longish time after the war for me. Ben learned, he learned earlier that I had survived because he was always very enterprising. And he went back to Poland. He traveled back to Poland after the war, immediately after liberation. And it was very difficult to actually get along because the trains were running, but they were stopping, and sometimes you could wait hours till they moved again. All communications in Europe after the war were really terrible, very poor. So, but he got to Piotrków and to see who's there, who survived. And he met somebody who had been liberated from Bergen-Belsen. And he saw me in Bergen-Belsen after the war, not during, because men and women were always separately. But he found out that I was in Sweden, that I had gone to Sweden. So he already knew that. And but I didn't know that he had survived. So I learned that much later, when I received a letter from him, the first letter.
And so, what was it like when you saw him for the first time afterwards?
Well, first of all, I had to wait quite a long time because I had to have a visa, and I had to allow the visa, but it took ages issuing the visa. But then somebody had a bright idea. Well, you know about the boys? you all know about the boys.
Yeah,
They'll be on, I think the film will be on tomorrow evening. And the Windermere boys. He was there and we were corresponding. And now I've lost my trend and I don't know what I was going to tell you about that. But my brother was one of the Windermere boys. And yeah, at that time, the government gave visas for 1,000 children from the camps. But in the event, they only found 722. Yeah, 700, that's as I remember it, maybe slightly different. So somebody had this bright idea saying, look, we never got the number of children, not many children left after the war. Can't you use one of these visas that weren't used then for this girl? And they did. So that was one way of eventually getting a visa, because it was going to take a long time otherwise. So I came here in 47 by boat. Ben met me at, I've now forgotten the name of the, it's so well known, and I always knew it, but it's gone. Anyway, one of the ports in England. He came with a friend who was from Piotrków as well, whom I knew. Well, it's very difficult to describe. I mean, it was joyous and it was happy, but it was also sad, because then we started discussing our own sort of experiences, and I learned what happened to my father, because I had no idea. And he was actually in a death march. And he was still in pretty good shape and he would have survived. But because he was always very enterprising and took chances and he wasn't afraid of anything, and while he couldn't escape from a camp, from a concentration camp or a labor camp, wherever he was, where they had electric fences and so on. Here he was suddenly in the open, and it seemed like, he'll escape. I mean, this is my story. This is what I imagine. And he and a few others tried to escape, and they were all shot. And that was only 4 days before the end of the war in that area, because the war finished at different times in different parts of Europe. So that's how I lost my father. I learned that. And well, we went back by train to London, and I remember looking out the window and all the houses with all the chimneys. There were so many chimneys. These were my first impressions, and we went to a London station, a very big London station, but I can't remember the name of it now. And from there we took the underground, and I went to the sort of hostel where the boys were, but I came under the auspices of Central British Fund, which is now World Jewish Relief. And they arranged for me to take the place temporarily of one of the girls that came, was the boys, and 2 brothers. She was recuperating from an operation, not a serious operation, but in those days, people always had to recuperate after operations. I don't think it happens today very much. So she was away somewhere, and they said, well, she'll be back in a couple of weeks, so you can stay in her room. Her 2 brothers had the room next door, and we had a landlady who was very nice. And I stayed, but I stayed on after she came back because there was a couch there, so I slept on the couch. So that's it after the war. That's not all of it. And I might tell you that the first organization I joined was Habonim. And it really, the Hendon branch, we used to meet at the Hendon Shul. And I made really lovely friends there. And then I was sort of persuaded, I was invited to join for Alei Tzion. Do you know? It probably doesn't exist today. It was a political party in Israel, but that was the young group of that party. That party still exists, but it may be called something else. And there I met my husband to be, but after some time. He was actually, you said at the beginning, he was a soldier, but come back from, from the army. And he was actually an architectural student, and he had to resume his studies, which he left in the middle, and when he was called up. And then I met him, we got married, and I have 2 children, and that's about my story.
Thank you so much, Marla, for taking us through your story. So I'm gonna, Harrison's now going to take us through some questions that were submitted before.
Thank you so much, Marla, for your testimony. Really amazing to hear. We have quite a few questions, so apologies in advance if I don't get to your question. I'm just going to try and sort of group a couple of them together because a lot of them were on similar themes, if that's okay. So we had quite a few questions on your sort of beliefs and what kept you going throughout this period. So we had a question on how these experiences affected your faith and whether you had faith and what role that played in your ordeal and what kept you going.
Okay, I'll be as brief as I can, because that could be a half an hour question. But I have to say, I didn't think about God in the camp. I don't know what my belief was as a young girl. I knew that my parents were moderately Orthodox, and my mother more than my father. And my mother told me there is a God and I've got to respect him and to behave myself. And if I don't, I might be punished. I don't think that was the best thing to tell a child. So I imagined that there was a God somewhere up there watching me and everybody else. But I didn't have any thoughts or feelings about it to an extent, because I don't remember thinking about God. Why has God forsaken us? But I do remember, and it's a really clear memory, that in one of the camps, and that must have been Ravensbrück, I remember sitting on my bunk, and we were 4 to the bunk, heads, and our heads, sometimes you stretched your legs and you poked someone in the face, but I remember sitting and thinking, does anybody know outside what's going on, what's happening to us? I sort of imagined that I didn't know anything about the war, how it was going, who was winning, who was losing. And I questioned the people. I thought, well, they've locked us away here and nobody knows. But I never questioned God. So but as for my belief, because I speak in schools, mostly Christian schools, or Muslims as well, but certainly non-Jewish schools. So when they ask me that, then I tell them what I've told you, but I add to it that if I had to choose a religion, I would choose the Jewish religion. And then I give them the reasons, because I think it has religion with a lot of moral values, with great attention to children, the importance of children. And they really, they take an important part. There's and it's enjoyable because a lot of the festivals and the way they're celebrated, it's a religion I enjoy. I practice it to a certain extent. I'm not extremely religious, that I am, I belong to shul, and I am conscious of my community. I want to know my community. So I describe the Jewish religion to others. And as far as I'm concerned, now that I've got a Jewish audience, I'll say the same. I am moderately religious. I observe the festivals, but I don't practice to any really serious or great extent.
You mentioned you mentioned your what you were thinking about in the camps, and I was just wondering, you went through this whole experience as a child, and as someone so young, did you have an idea that this was happening to you because you were Jewish, and that people were doing this to you because of the fact that you were Jewish?
Yes, well, not really. I don't know whether I thought about it, but I did a Zoom the other day. It was an international Zoom, but it was of a very big company. Well, I can talk about it, it's not a secret. The BT. I was speaking to BT. They're very big internationally. I thought British, they're just in Britain, but they're international. And the person in charge she drew my attention to something which is quite significant. I was saying that something I haven't told you, that they were, during the war, there was a reward for handing in Jews. So people made it, some of them made it into some lucrative, income. And I was describing my journey to Częstochowa, and not with my cousin because we're traveling separately, but I was saying that if someone looked at me for more than a couple of seconds, because we were always so frightened, I thought, oh, I bet he is suspecting me of being Jewish, and I will be turned over to the Gestapo. And this young lady, who was very perceptive and very articulate, and she really seemed to be very intelligent, and she picked this up. She said, when you said they suspecting you, and she didn't say a lot more, and it sort of points out to you that I was a suspect, so I must have committed a crime. So what was my crime? Being Jewish was a crime. And that sort of really puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So I picked that up from her, actually.
We had a few other questions on how you feel about those experiences today, and how you remember that time today, and whether that's changed over the course of your life, the way that you think about the Holocaust.
It has changed over time, because it was very much with me for a long time, because as it moved further and further down the years, it fades a little bit, but you can't remember, in the sense that you can't remember every detail of every day, but it still stays with you because it was so enormous, and it was so, in a way, life-changing, but I mean in a bad way. And it does stay with me, and especially because I talk about it so often. but I feel, and I often think, well, people must think, well, it's really difficult talking about it. Why do I do it? And I do it because I think it's important that people know what happened and that these victims are never forgotten. I'm not talking about myself, the victims who never survived. And I had a letter from a Christian boy, a sixth former, years ago, and he expressed so many important things about the Holocaust. And I haven't got time to tell you everything, but he said that we must do something about it so that people won't forget. Because if we forget, they will have got away with it. And you know, that's something I haven't thought of. And this is a Christian boy. And he really understood the whole thing so deeply. So that is another reason for not forgetting. And this is why I go on talking.
Thank you. You speak so calmly and without any sense of anger or vengeance. We've had a couple of questions about how you feel about Germany or Germans today, and whether that's something you've ever thought about, and whether you've met any.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because it gives me an opportunity to tell you that I speak, I look very relaxed and calm, and people think, oh, that's strange. Well, you know, she should be really het up, crying, and God knows what. But, you know, if I couldn't do it this way, I wouldn't do it, because I'm not, I wouldn't sort of show my feelings to that extent in public. I don't really feel calm about it, but this is a comment I've had made very often. It's true, but I'm that sort of person. Oh, there was something I was going to say, and it's just gone out of my head. Yeah, I once listened to a friend. I had spoken before, and she was speaking. Was a special sort of. Yes, it was on Holocaust Memorial Day, and it was the events in schools. Every school would have an event with children from local schools coming in, and a survivor speaker. And my friend was speaking, and she was crying all the way through her talk. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's not only is she suffering, but it's so sad that, and after all, she doesn't have to speak if it's that bad. And I went up to her afterwards and I said, I'm really sorry it's affecting you so badly. She said, no, it's not the Holocaust. My son has got multiple sclerosis, and his wife left him. Her husband, his wife, the tribe left him because of it. So she left him because he's got multiple sclerosis. So she was very sad about that, and that's what she was crying about. I don't know, but if I felt like that, I couldn't just make a scene in front of people. I just control it, and I'm able to sort of hide my my reactions to it, and not show them publicly. If I couldn't, I wouldn't talk about it.
And we've had a couple of questions also about.
Oh, sorry, but you asked me about how I feel towards the Germans. I want to tell you that specifically, because people say, well, do you hate Germans? No, I always say, but I do it the wrong way around, because I say I don't hate the Germans today. And this, I don't hate them, but that sort of stays with them, and they think I don't hate the perpetrators, although I say I do. Now, I never forgive the perpetrators, So do forgive them. And I do hate them and I don't forgive them. But that is the people who actually caused it and who carried it out. But I make a special point of telling them that I do not hate the Germans of today. Can't hold them responsible for what their fathers or great grandfathers did.
Absolutely. I wanted to. We've had a couple of questions about what you think of the state of Holocaust remembrance and education today, and how you see the future of remembering the Holocaust.
Well, at the moment, it looks very promising because whenever there's a commemoration, people really do take it seriously. They attend, and the numbers are getting bigger and bigger. And I know that while the Holocaust survivors are still around, I know from the way they try so hard to help us and look after us and appreciate us. I don't quite know how many things to say, but so I don't know how it will be later. I imagine that gradually, as there are no survivors left, it'll still go on, and I don't know to what extent. But at the moment, I mean, there's so much activity on any commemoration. There's so much kindness to the survivors, and that wasn't there at the beginning. And the survivors have quite a history about how the treatment of them change over the years, especially in Israel.
Well, we're definitely we're keen to treat you all as kindly as possible at this point, and I know that everyone here will go on to attend these commemorations and to put all of their effort into them. I just wanted to ask just one more question. We've had a question in mentioning the fact that you speak at lots of Jewish and non-Jewish schools and you speak to so many people, and whether you notice a difference in the reaction or the questions that you get from a Jewish audience versus a non-Jewish audience, and whether you feel there's a big difference there.
Well, I don't speak to many Jewish schools. They're very few and far between. I don't know why some people do. I just haven't been asked. If I'm asked, I wouldn't say no, but I simply haven't been asked much by Jewish schools. But I found when I did speak, I get much greater attention from non-Jews, especially in recent years, not right at the beginning. But these days, if I were to show you some of the letters that they write, they are quite incredible. It really keeps me going, knowing that they appreciate it so very much. And they express themselves so well. And one of the things they say is, I promise you that I will always remember your story and I'll tell it to my children and my grandchildren. And they say other things. I wish those letters could sort of get out into the public to see what young people think. I mean, maybe they don't mean it. No, those that they've written to me, they do mean it. But that doesn't mean to say that all of them feel like that. There are plenty that probably not interested at all. But the ones who are write the most amazing letters. I couldn't write a letter like that. And they're only like 14, 15, or sometimes they're sixth formers.
Well, we're joined by lots of different Jewish youth, and I'm sure everyone's been feels similarly. And I'd just like to thank you so much, and just hand over. We've run out of time for questions, unfortunately. So I'm just going to hand over to Imi, who's going to say a couple of closing words.
So actually, I think before that, Cassie just wants to talk a little bit about March the Living, the amazing organisation that brought Marla here before we close. So Cassie, do you wanna go for it?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining this session with Marla. Marla has been accompanying March of the Living to Poland now for, I think, nearly 10 years. For those of you who haven't heard about March of the Living, we run an annual 5-day educational programme in Poland that ties in with Yom HaShoah and finishes with the iconic march from Auschwitz to Birkenau with around 10,000 people from all around the world. Each year we take various different buses, but one of the buses is a bus of all youth movement members that are post-school age. Obviously this year, due to the current restrictions, we are unable to attend in April, but we are going to run a very special 4-day programme in October to Germany with Marla to visit Ravensbrück, Berlin, Amberg and Belsen. And you'll notice from the talk this evening that Marla was actually in Ravensbrück, Amberg and Belsen. So you can only imagine how special this 4-day programme is going to be. And then we will have our next Poland programme in April 2022. If any of you are interested in joining either of these programmes, or if you're slightly younger and maybe starting to think about them for your first year out of school, please go on our website. It's marchoftheliving.org.uk. And there's a register your interest button. If you fill in your details, we can send you all the information about Poland or Germany, and hopefully we'll see you on a youth movement bus in the future. And thank you all for joining, and I'm going to hand over, and also thank you for inviting March of the Living to be part of the Zionist Youth Council Holocaust Memorial Day. And I'm going to hand over to Imi, I think, just to wrap up.
Cool, thank you. So that brings this event to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and joining us on the night before Holocaust Memorial Day. Thank you to Cassie and March of the Living for organising this. But most importantly, thank you, Marla, so much for coming and speaking to us all this evening. It's such an honour to have you here and to chat with you, especially during these crazy times. It's amazing that we can utilise Zoom to create such a special space. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone here when you're such much for the time tonight. We thought, actually, Marla, if you wouldn't mind just answering one more question so we can end this event with a little bit of advice. And this was a question submitted by one of the people in the audience here tonight. So if we could end on this, Marla, what one piece of advice would you give to us as young people today?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that, because I should leave you with a message that how important it is to remember the Holocaust. Because I've actually mentioned it before, it comes out in other questions as well. I personally feel that because some of the families were absolutely wiped out, everybody, not only the immediate family, but the cousins and the friends and the neighbors, and there's just nobody to remember them. And remembrance is so important in the Jewish religion. The important thing is that you don't forget the victims. Although there's another part that I would also say, that you should be aware of what's going on, and you should protest when you see some, I've run out of words. If you see when people are unfair and there's prejudice and there's discrimination, and you really, I would like to see you fight for a better word, and when there's, and stand up and be counted. So I leave you with those two messages.
Thank you so much, Marla. I think that's a message that we can all take and remember, and continue standing up and doing what us youth movement members do. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Marla, again, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.